I'm just so pleased that he could be with us today to share his thoughts on servant leadership and his perspective on the many lessons he's learned through his life. So let's welcome John Taft.
Wow, that was amazing that you've internalized all that. Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Don. I'm back, not by popular demand, but by Don Salverda request. I haven't learned how to say no to him. I knew of him. I knew of him when I worked for George Latimer because he was Ramsey County Commissioner, and there was something about Ramsey County, a little bit like Anoka County Commissioners, maybe county commissioners generally. They're sort of an opaque, inscrutable group, and I was never enough. Yeah, George McMahon over here is now a county commissioner in Chisago County, but I was never on the inside of things Ramsey County. At any rate, George was asked once by the press why he had hired me. I lived in Minneapolis and I was a Republican, and he said, well, he thought for a minute, he said, there are 2,000 employees of the city of St. Paul. I thought one of them should be a Republican. But let me tell you, I'm a very bad Republican. We had a fundraiser with 100 people in our backyard last weekend for Amy Klobuchar. I worked for George Latimer, and so people say, how can you do that with your legacy? I said, listen, I am a genetic Republican. The other thing is, the Republicans of my family legacy bear no resemblance at all to the Republicans of today. There's been a recent explosion of books on William Howard Taft, one by a Yale professor who then wrote an article in the Atlantic magazine which said Taft, the anti-Trump. Now, that's a silly construct because, that was then, this is now. But what he talked about was just the difference along a number of different dimensions in the way Taft saw the world. We're talking about 1909 to 1913 as the years he was president. The differences in the way they saw the world, the most interesting of which today was the different view they had of the presidency. My great-grandfather was a constitutional minimalist when it came to the role of the presidency and the executive branch in democracy. And he was quoted as saying that it was always the restrictions and limitations imposed on him by the Constitution that struck him more than the powers conferred on him by the Constitution. And night and day difference from what we have today. But if you think about it, it wasn't just Trump. Trump is just the latest in a long line of presidents who have believed in an imperial presidency and have tried to push the limits of presidential power. And of course, we're involved in a debate right now about have we gone too far? Haven't we gone far enough? I would just say that William Howard Taft would be rolling over in his grave. And I also want to say that if I sound political today, I'm not. I literally am an independent. I have no political axe to grind. But I am going to get into some issues that you might want to pick up and talk about. One other thing I want to say is that the company I work for today, Robert W. Baird, is based in Milwaukee, but I'm proud to say up here in Roseville, in the orbit of Ramsey County and St. Paul, we are opening up a St. Paul office this summer, and we're going to have George Latimer and Chris Coleman and Mayor Carter all come to the open house, and it's exciting. I think it's a great place for us to be, and I look forward to being able to go back downtown and make mischief, as I did in the days when George McMahon was running around St. Paul. And we did some great things together. So I'm going to talk, yes, about servant leadership, but I'm really going to talk about stewardship, which is the title of my first book, written in 2012. The full title was Stewardship: Lessons Learned from the Lost Culture of Wall Street. So there are really two purposes to the book. The first one was for participants in the financial services industry, and it was really, the point was to prove or to make the point that a failure to stay in touch with the core principle of stewardship was one of the things that contributed to the financial crisis. But what is stewardship, anyways? Well, it's a secular and a religious concept. You read about it a lot in the Bible. We are stewards of God's dominion, the earth, for as long as we're on it. And there's also a secular use of the word, which is, is back in the day when the king or queen went abroad to fight a war or find a spouse. Stewards of the kingdom manage the kingdom in his absence. So if you go to the definition I like best is actually in Wikipedia. Stewardship there is defined as responsibly managing what others have entrusted to your care. And if you think about it, nothing could be a better principle upon which the financial services industry should be based. And we lost touch with that. We stopped, we forgot that in finance, we're supposed to be a means to greater ends. We're supposed to be a facilitator of economic activity. We're supposed to match people who have money or institutions who have money, they're called investors, with organizations, public, private, and not-profit, that need capital and can put it to productive use, making a better world for all of us. And we're supposed to connect the two in a way that manages the risks of doing that and leaves everybody better off than they would without a financial services industry. That's what we're supposed to do. That's the role finance is supposed to play in society. We are supposed to be means to other ends. And what happened was we started thinking of ourselves, and most of the book is about this. There are lots of reasons for why we did it, as means to our own ends. So we started looking at finance as a way to enrich ourselves and our shareholders and so forth. And so what I wanted to say is, well, let's take the financial crisis and let's use it as a case study for what happens when we lose touch with our stewardship values. That happened in finance. And now let's look at other areas. So that was part of the book, and most of it was about that. But then the lessons learned part from the lost culture of Wall Street was, now let's look at other areas where stewardship failure might be present, and where we are looking at the early minutes of a movie that we already saw, the financial crisis. Is stewardship failure playing out in other areas in our world today? And I listed three. This is 2012. Climate change, global warming. Are we responsibly managing what God, previous generations, future generations have entrusted to our care, the environment? Are we doing that? And okay, let's park that. What about income inequality? How are we doing on that front? And what about just the financial health of our government? Not just ours, but governments around the world. Are we paying down debt and building up reserves for future generations, or are we engaged in an exercise we are just appropriating future quality of life for ourselves today and indebting generations going forward. So I said in all these areas, my personal feeling is we're watching train wrecks in slow motion. They're all caused by stewardship failure, the same type of stewardship failure that brought us the financial crisis. The financial crisis was the ghost of Christmas past. These are the ghosts of Christmas future. And I know this is the Optimist Club. So the good news, I said, is that these can all be addressed and corrected if we, excuse the expression, man up and take on our stewardship responsibilities and demonstrate the behaviors I talk about in the book: purposefulness, humility, accountability, foresight, and integrity, which are the characteristics of responsible stewards. And the bad news is, since 2012, we have gone nowhere. In fact, we've gone backwards. If you had a scale that could measure stewardship quality in society, we're performing worse by any and all measures of stewardship than we were in the years leading up to the financial crisis. So I have a bunch of proof points of that. When we go to questions, you can certainly ask me about it. But everywhere I look today, not everywhere, but in too many places, I see near-term greed trumping long-term stewardship. And that is incredibly concerning to me. So I believe stewardship failure that we're witnessing is really leadership failure. That somewhere over the course of the last century, we lost touch and we stopped valuing the notion that those of us who occupy leadership positions in society have an obligation to help improve society in ways that benefit everybody. So David Brooks, I quoted him in my profile of George Latimer. He's one of my favorite writers. He's just written a new book that I would recommend to you. But the quotes from in the George Latimer article I wrote were about gracious leadership. But he wrote another column called The Strange Failure of the Educated Elite. And he said, look, I'm a product of meritocracy. I got to where I am because people who were smart and capable, worked hard, could get to be a columnist for the New York Times. But he said, those dim-witted, stuck-up blue bloods in the old establishment had something we meritocrats lack: a civic consciousness, a sense that we have lived life embedded in community and nation, that we owe a debt to community and nation, and that the essence of the admirable life is community before self. I believe that in a nutshell, is the antidote to many of the challenges we are facing in society today. And I think stewardship is a kissing cousin of servant leadership. Now, those of you who, it sounds like many of you are steeped in the notion of servant leadership, the idea was coined and the concept was coined by Robert Greenleaf, who was an IBM executive in the 1970s. And he wrote an article, seminal article, called The Leader is Servant, and he said, servant leadership assumes first and foremost a commitment to serving the needs of others. True leadership emerges from those whose motivation is a desire to help others. Now, I grew up with a family legacy. Actually, it was my great-great-grandfather, Alfonso Taft, president, great name, awful name. The other big name in my family is Horace, so Alfonso and Horace are Taft standards. But he was Attorney General of the United States before William Howard Taft. Then William Howard Taft Had a son, Robert Taft. His nicknames were Mr. Republican, Mr. Integrity. When I'm in Washington, D.C., I testify and go up and visit the Hill a lot on industry issues, and I walk past a 9-story bell tower with a waiting pool, a reflecting pool, statue of my grandfather, and inscriptions from his career carved in marble, signature of Dwight Eisenhower when the monument was put up. It's the only monument to a member of Congress ever to have been built on the Capitol grounds. So it is 200 yards from the Capitol. And I stand there with my grandfather. I hear the bells ring. I look at the Capitol, and I just get shivers, goosebumps. And I'm incredibly inspired, and at the same time, incredibly depressed. You know, and what have I done for society compared to this man? But then he had a son who was ambassador to Ireland. He had a son who was U.S. Senator. The U.S. Senator had a son who was governor of Ohio. So we have 6 generations of public servant leadership. And so I grew up with that, you know, kind of mantle, if you will, that notion that whatever I do, I have to make my ancestors proud, which means living up to this notion of public service. But I didn't live the notion of servant leadership until the financial crisis hit. And I have a former colleague here, John Conlon, who was with me during those days, and they were awful. You might remember them well. We remember them forever, till the day we die. And we had $250 billion of clients' assets, and in the course of a few months, they were cut in half in value. And we were getting calls from our clients and trying to explain to them, hold their hands, what was going on. But the truth is, we didn't know. The securities that they held were behaving in ways that they'd never behaved before, at least not in our lifetimes. And one day, I got a phone call. We had bought a brokerage firm on the East Coast, and we were waiting to merge them with our own brokerage firm, and they swept their clients' cash into a tiny, 60 billion, believe it or not, is tiny, money market fund called the Reserve Fund. And the Reserve Fund had bought commercial paper issued by Lehman Brothers. And so the date, the weekend that Lehman Brothers went bankrupt, the Reserve Fund valued their portfolio, and they were not able to guarantee shareholders who had put money in that they would get $1 back for every dollar they put in the fund. And that literally was the moment that the global financial system stepped to the brink. We literally, people don't know how close we came to everything freezing up, because funds like the Reserve Fund, of how big corporations like GE or Bank of America borrow on a daily basis and fund their operations. And if people were going to withdraw their money from money market funds, there would be no place for these massive corporations to get funding on a daily basis, and the whole system would have seized up. At any rate, the trustees did what they should have done. The trustees of this little fund just said, whoa, if we let a run on the bank, so to speak, take place, we'll have to fire sale these assets, and we will never get their money back. We're going to do the mutual fund equivalent of locking the doors to the bank and barring the windows. So they suspended redemptions. All of a sudden, our clients who were counting on the ability to call their financial advisor, say, I need $10,000 tomorrow to pay my kids' tuition, I need to make a down payment on the house I'm buying, they had no access to cash. They held a potentially permanently illiquid security that had no value of any kind. And on top of everything, I just remember my own net worth was evaporating in front of my eyes. I had 2,000 advisors like John calling up, crazy issues every day. And we just, the phones lit up and say, if you don't solve this problem, you're going to lose the firm. You're going to lose the firm. You will not survive this. We were able to manage our way through it, but I won't get into that. But what happened was I just thought, wow, this is it. I'm a boxing fan, and one of my favorite movies is called When We Were Kings, and it's about the Muhammad Ali-George Foreman fight in Africa. So Ali had been in and out, and he went to jail and he came out, and they literally thought Foreman was going to kill him in the ring. They were going to witness a beating that would destroy Muhammad Ali. So lots of drama around in the first ring. Nothing really happened, but Ali goes back to his corner, and the narrator of the movie is the novelist Norman Mailer, and they pan in on Ali's eyes, and he's just like, and Norman Mailer says it's like he's looking into the eyes of his maker. He's reaching into his soul, and he's saying, "You better get it together, boy. You're not gonna survive this thing." As we know, he did, and he ended up winning the fight dramatically. So that's the way I felt. I just thought, you are no good to anybody. I was losing my stuff. My head was spinning literally, and I just thought, you have got to get it together. And so I thought, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're just going to go down. I had this feeling I was going down, down, down an elevator shaft. And we're going to go down until we find solid ground. And I remember finding it, and I felt like I got it. And it was a really simple idea, but it's the core idea, and the core notion behind servant leadership, and the first time I experienced it for myself, was I thought, I don't matter. My job right now is to forget about myself and help other people get through this crisis. I remember it was like an epiphany. I had an absolute conviction about that. And it sounds silly, I felt like I had the strength of 10,000 people because I knew what I needed to do. And that is the notion. I experienced the power behind servant leadership. I've talked about this to lots of groups. I had the honor of being asked to give a speech to the honors graduates at the University of St. Thomas, from the University of St. Thomas Business School, Opus School of Business, last year. So I wrote a speech and then I published it called Lead in the Service of Others. And I'm just going to end my remarks by reading from that speech and then open it up for questions. So I said, servant leadership begins with a shift from self to others. Servant leadership involves a choice for service. When we see ourselves not just as individual actors, but as members of communities, when we define ourselves not in terms of self-interest alone, but in terms of how we can serve others, when we all wake up every morning and think about what we are going to do in the course of the day, whether it's in our work, our personal lives, or in our community, when we think of all that in terms of serving others. What a radically different view of leadership that is than what we see in the world today. We are living in an age of grandiosity, the imperial presidency, the superstar CEO. In order to do what it takes to be elected to high office or run a company, it seems necessary to have more than your fair share of narcissism in your character. I think that's due to the ubiquitous nature of media, traditional and social, which has given rise to self-aggrandizement as an advancement strategy. But true leadership is exactly the opposite. It is about suppressing ego in the service of others. True leadership in any organization means understanding that as a leader, you hold a type of office, can be formal or informal office, in which you have a responsibility to your constituents. They can be voters, citizens of the governmental unit you represent. They can be employees. They can be clients. They can be shareholders. They can be customers. They can be communities in which your shareholders, clients, customers, voters live and work. There's a close relationship between servant leadership and stewardship, defined as responsibly managing what others have entrusted to your care. There is a close relationship between servant leadership and community, with the notion that we are all responsible for the well-being of others in the community. And today, it is not an exaggeration to say that we are part of a global community. We inhabit a planet alongside billions of other people, more people than ever before in human history. We live in a globally interconnected flat world in which any action by a private party anywhere in the world somehow affects another person somehow somewhere else in the world. And in that global community, servant leaders who act on the core principle of stewardship values are literally the key to our survival in the years ahead. So that's my shtick on servant leadership and stewardship. We can go anywhere you want. We have about 20 minutes, I think. So fire away. Yes?
The rift between the Tafts and the Roosevelts that happened, and when they actually ended up running against each other, did that ever get healed, or did the families and ancestors deal with that? Where's that stand today?
Yes.
Can you repeat the question, please?
The question was the rift between the Tafts and the Roosevelts, Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft in particular. Did that ever get healed? So what happened was that Taft worked for they were best friends. And by the way, I recommend a book by Doris Kearns Goodwin. It was published a few years ago called The Bully Pulpit, which is about Roosevelt, Taft, and the press. And it's about Taft and Roosevelt's relationship. And it's really interesting, in part, just to read. It was incredibly close relationship, the most important relationship for both men. And it was back in the day, they went on long trips, rail car around the country. They'd been going for 3 months, 6 months, and they would write each other. And these letters, there was something about the distance and formality of letter writing that allowed them to be incredibly intimate. It's like two male lovers writing to each other. It's incredible. My dearest Theodore, hardly a moment goes by when I don't long for the friendship that brings me joy every day. I mean, it's unbelievable. So it was incredibly close. And Taft was Roosevelt's. By the way, I would say Roosevelt was the early 1900s version of Donald Trump, if you read the book. There's a lot of similarities. But Taft was Secretary of War for Roosevelt, his loyal aide, longtime friend, and Taft really picked him to be his successor, endorsed him in the election. And there was this thing with Roosevelt became president when McKinley was assassinated, and so had a 2-term pledge. So he served out the rest of McKinley's term, and then he got elected for a second term, and there was a controversy. Well, could he run again and not violate his pledge not to serve more than 2 terms? And he decided no. So he said, but Taft's my guy. And so Taft became president with Roosevelt's support, and then Roosevelt went on a bunch of hunting trips around the world, Africa. And in the course of all of that, people who didn't agree with what Taft was doing started pinging Roosevelt, and he came back and, what's going on, Willie? They ended up having a very acrimonious parting of the ways, and it was ugly. Roosevelt ran against Taft for the Republican nomination. He lost. He then formed the Bull Moose Party and split the Republican vote, and Wilson was elected. So they parted. At that point, they were enemies. But Doris Kearns Goodwin, so she did the research, says that they did meet before Roosevelt died first. He was very ill, And Roosevelt was in a room having breakfast, and he was in the corner. And Taft walked in, and with another group, didn't know they were going to be there, saw Roosevelt, went over. Roosevelt got up out of his chair, they embraced, and he is reported to have said, "Oh, Theodore, I've missed you so much." And the entire room burst into applause. So at the end, they reconciled. And that's her story, which I want to believe, and I do believe she did a lot of work. Sir?
You talked about the definition of stewardship in terms of religious and secular.
Yes.
What part did your faith play when you're headed down the elevator shaft and finding?
I'm a light touch Episcopalian. You know, I was baptized at the age of 50 in St. Mark's Cathedral here in Minnesota by my best friend who was the dean of the, and my wife was an atheist, and she was crying. Not from joy. She thought I was joining a cult, quite frankly, the cult of people who believed things that were demonstrably not true. So our nanny, she wouldn't be my godparent. What do you do at 50 years old? Who's your godparent? So our nanny was my godparent, agreed to be my godparent. But I don't see any, to me the most important thing is this movement, which is why I went through that long story about the elevator shaft. The moment at which you experience the shift from self to others. I think literally that is all good things in life come from that. I really do. And there's a religious equivalent of that, but there are also secular equivalents of that. And there are few of us who are selflessly other-focused all the time. We go in and we go out. But when I look at the moments that have meant the most to me, and where I've said, you know, that's why I'm here, they've been moments of other-centeredness, uniformly, not self-centeredness. Yes?
So, sort of meta, is servant leadership on the decline right now, or is it going the other way? And with that, I mean, is it going to be like generational, or do you need sort of those moments of the financial crisis? Like, are we responding to certain things that help us get to that point?
I think character and leadership is forged in crisis. I think you learn about yourself, and you forged in crisis. I don't know if so. I do think that Rahm Emanuel expression, never waste a crisis, also, it's not just about affecting change in the world. I think it's also about affecting change in yourself. So I personally, the thing that upsets me is I grew up feeling, and I think many people in the room did, maybe it was my background, that the highest form of leadership was political. In other words, being elected to office was a cut above, you know, being a CEO or running a not-for-profit, all of that. And today, that's where the leadership failure and the stewardship failure is most pronounced. You know, just because of who I am and because politics is the family business, you know, I used to be asked all the time, you know, when are you going to run for office? Well, I have a problem. I'm unelectable. I am a Republican who is basically a Democrat, you know, with everything I believe. And so I'm unelectable, plus I'm rich, white, you know, middle-aged, all the things that appear to be out of favor. But I also wouldn't want to do it. It doesn't, in other words, so I've picked, for me, a path, say, where can I be the most effective steward I can, and where can I be truest to my stewardship values? And I think of it as civic engagement. So it's not merely being a CEO, it's being a civically engaged person. So you work for the St. Paul and Minnesota foundations. I'm on the board of the Minneapolis Foundation, been on the board of, you know, dozens of not-for-profits, gotten involved in things, some political issues where I thought I could add value. So, but as a private citizen, because I feel today, as a private citizen, I can actually be more effective, or at least more effective and remain true to who I am, versus going into the public sector where everybody, you just, I don't know, it's very depressing on both sides of the aisle to see see the choices we have. So, sir.
Which then basically says this ideal perfect person as described as a servant leadership probably won't ever get to be president.
Why? The point being that a servant leader, the ideal person, the person we most admire probably won't get to be president. Well, there's an interesting book I read many, many years ago. First of all, I agree with your statement. I think that's entirely possible. It was called When Society Becomes an Addict. Now it's got a lot of psycho jargon in it, but the concept is, all right, wait a minute. What does it say about us as a society when the people who are most successful exhibit the same character traits that were forged in and required to survive dysfunctional families? Well, it says that society is dysfunctional. And so personally, I personally think that really good leaders, I call them functional narcissists. They are self-involved, but only up to a point, and they're able to put that to work for others. But we have dysfunctional narcissists today in public office, because to do what it takes to get elected to high office, you have to have character traits that are different from the true leadership traits that we so desperately need to solve the problems we face. So I agree with your comment. And until that changes, and I don't know what would change it, there wasn't social media. If you looked at William Howard Taft, he wasn't the most photogenic, and he was a terrible speaker. He spoke for an hour to 2 hours, droned on in a kind of constitutional lawyer's fact-based, making a case and argument. My grandfather, Robert Taft, who was a Senate Majority Leader of the Republican Party, had this high nasal voice and wire-rimmed glasses and a bald head. And I mean, I watch videos of him, and they're like, there's no way he does CNN town hall debate. They'd laugh him off the stage. But they both had leadership qualities, and that trumped media presence. And that's not possible today, necessarily, unless you're so weird, you're endearing, So. Sir.
I want to thank you for your courage and your integrity.
Well, thank you.
I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
So much.
Well, you're welcome. I appreciate your comment. Yes, sir.
So, I met with,
Uh-oh, he's got the book.
recommend it,
So you can't get the hard copy anymore. It's out of print. You can download it. There's even an audio book version. But before you think I'm shamelessly hawking my children's retirement fund, all proceeds go to charity. And so of this book and that book, and specifically they go to charities focused on financial literacy, because one of the problems we have is that the gap between what people know about financial markets and what they need to know is wide. And that's why you see all these abuses, is because there's just not an educated enough populace out there. So at any rate, you were going to say, Kyle.
Yeah, so you talk about it in the book a little bit, but in that moment where you have 2,000 financial advisors all looking at you as the leader, how were you able to stay calm and
I wasn't.
confident? Or if you weren't, yeah,
No, I wasn't. That was a point. It wasn't until, and I was completely disoriented, and it wasn't until I had this moment where I just say, okay, forget about yourself. Any problems I have, we'll deal with tomorrow. And I just started focusing on, so what we ended up doing for this reserve fund is we did a calculation, and we thought, okay, worst case, we looked at the portfolio in this money market fund. We said, worst case, it's worth 97 cents on the dollar. It's not that it's worth zero, it's worth 97 cents on the dollar. So we went and we put out a release and we said to our clients, we will make anyone whole up to 3 cents, which is what we think your potential loss is. And if you need money to make that tuition payment or make a down payment on the house, we'll lend it to you basically at zero cost or our cost of funds. And no questions asked. We'll make a hardship loan. And that was typical with a lot of crisis decisions. We went from potential disaster to enormous brand building value by doing that. Now, why wasn't that easy? Because it cost over $30 million. It was a hit. We had to record the difference between $1 a share and $97 a share across all our customer assets as an expense the day we made that decision, and it was $30 million hit to our bottom line. So I reported up to a bunch of people in Canada, and that was an interesting exercise. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Just in context, how many other, of your competitors out in the market did something similar?
There were 2 other firms of size that had the same problem. One of them was Ameriprise in town here, big firm in Minnesota and nationally. They followed our lead. The other firm, I don't know what they did, but they didn't do that. But this was actually only one of a number of issues in the financial markets. There were securities, there were all sorts of securities that were issued on the assumption that short-term money markets would behave somewhat normally, and they didn't. They locked up. And people, in the municipal bond world, what happened was a lot of communities, rather than issuing long-term fixed-rate debt, decided to issue long-term bonds to fund schools, roads, bridges, whatever, but have a variable interest rate. And the interest rate would be reset every week or month based on demand for those types of paper. Well, during the financial crisis, demand went to zero. Nobody wanted to own that. And so there was nobody to reset, and so they failed. And at that point, they were illiquid. Nobody could buy or sell them. So there were billions of dollars of that out there, and very, very upset customers. And ultimately, it required the regulators to come in and mandate that firms buy those securities back from their clients dollar for dollar, and it was hundreds of millions of dollars in expense required to do that. So there were other examples of that. Not only did we get our clients in trouble, but as an industry, we didn't respond the way true stewards should have responded. And so that's why today, even today, you have multiple presidential candidates vilifying the financial services industry, and it's helping them in the polls, because people are still angry. Now, they're also angry about income inequality, which has gotten worse. Right after the financial crisis, there was this thing called the 1%, you remember, at the top, and there were drums beating in parks in New York. The income inequality gap has widened dramatically since then. I am not an Elizabeth Warren fan. This is not a political statement. But she does say something which is true. In my opinion, capitalism, which is the best economic system ever invented in the world, it has lifted people out of poverty around the world. It's like democracy. It's the worst system until you consider the alternative. It's the best ever invented. But in the United States and in other countries, it's been perverted, or it's evolved in a way that isn't healthy. It's become, and has been for years, what I would call crony capitalism, which just is to say that institutions and people with money and political clout are able to rig the system to tip results in their favor. And so influence in Washington, D.C. is a big deal. We actually have a financial analyst. All he does is write about Washington policy and its effect on markets, because it's never been bigger than it is today. And people's ability to affect what's going on in Washington affects their ability to perform financially. So we've been in a period of crony capitalism. But what's happening now, right in front of our eyes, and I'm sorry if I offend anybody, is we're actually moving further along the spectrum to outright oligarchy, where you see people going into public office for the purpose of making money for themselves. That's what goes on in Russia. Well, that is a red, blinking, flashing light. Because once you go there, then the other end starts to get real. That's when you start to get calls for socialism and all the stuff you're hearing right now. It's a reaction to the continuing evolution of our capitalist system in a direction that favors the people who already have means and standing, and away from people who don't. So I think that is stewardship failure, and I think that needs to be addressed. But it's just one of many challenges. It is the challenge of all these. Climate change, we will cease to exist as a species. Passing tax cuts that add $1 trillion of debt and take us beyond 100% of debt to GDP and put us into what's called a debt spiral, that will cripple future generations. But income inequality, if it continues, is where what revolutions are made of. And we haven't seen that in this country. But there are lots of people living in this country who have lived through periods of crisis like that. Why? Income inequality got out of control. So back to the Optimist Creed. Civic engagement, caring about these issues, taking them on as private citizens is something we can all do and need to do to make the world a better place. Thank you all very much for listening today. Okay, all right.
Well, if that didn't get us thinking, I don't know what will.
All right.
But I think that he touches more bases on the Optimist Creed than most of us try to get into every day, and I try to get one or two. But I do want to point out one that I think we should think about a lot, and it's point number 7, where it says, forget the mistakes of the past and press on to greater achievements of the future. After listening to you, yes, but I think what should say, to learn from the mistakes of the past. Something when we say this, think about that to yourself. And I'm not going to try to change the creed. But thank you so much for pointing this out.
Thank you for having me.
Appreciate it. We got the photographer here. I'm going to give you this guy right here.
All right, here we go.